what's so nice is it's so easy to harvest. You can bring it into your house, you can cut it open, put the seed on the counter and harvest that seed, and you can eat your squash. You can't do that with a lot of other things. Welcome to episode 32 of the Seed Farmer Podcast, the podcast where I want to convince you to harvest seeds from some of the vegetables and flowers growing in your farm or garden, and then to plant that seed out to grow delicious vegetables and beautiful flowers. If you enjoy the Seed Farmer Podcast and find it is a good resource that helps you improve your seed work and farming, please support the show at spreadsheet.farm/support podcast. The link is also in the show notes. I'm your host, Dan Brisebois, seed grower at Tournesol Cooperative Farm and author of The Seed Farmer, a complete guide to growing, using, and selling your own seeds. Here's another solo minisode. Without a guest, just me. I hope you like that anyway. This is a second episode that I just batched right after episode 31, talking about cut flowers. So that's kind of the headspace that I'm in right now. We're going to talk about squash today in a moment. But first, we'll do a little bit of, housekeeping. I have finally started to put episodes up on YouTube. So if you prefer listening to your podcasts on YouTube, you can go there and follow along. And right now, they should only come out a day or two after they are actually released. And soon enough, I assume, we'll probably get to the point where they're coming out simultaneously. And if you are listening on podcast, you can find episode 26 through, well, I guess by the time this is out, more or less 32. Molly and I are going to start getting the first batch of episodes 1 through 25, in some matter, to mess up this podcast feed as you're listening to, if you're listening to it in chronological order. That's specifically on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any of those great podcast apps or players, you could just, it's already there in the right order. That's a bit of housekeeping. In terms of what's going on at the farm, we just had our organic certification inspection, which is always an exciting time. And I'm lucky because, so I farm in a co-op with a number of other people, and Renee and Kala, two of my co-farmers, they deal with the bulk of the organic certification. There's so much of it that I don't have to think about. But when it comes to the actual seed production and then records of what we've purchased from contract growers and what we've sold, that's the stuff that I have that information. So I get to come into the certification at that point and talk through it at the inspection. And so for about 2 weeks before the inspection date, I will make a point of going through and make sure I have the receipts for the seeds that we've purchased, make sure I have all the certification, make sure that I have the planting records, harvest records, all those things. And one thing that happened this year is, I thought I had gone through and gotten a bunch of them, and then I couldn't find them anymore. And I had to go kind of catching them up again and putting them together in my Dropbox. And after a couple days of being frustrated with things disappearing, I realized that I was using two computers to do this work, a desktop and a laptop, and one of them was not syncing with Dropbox. So whatever I did in one wasn't showing up in the other, which was immensely frustrating in the limited time that I was stealing to do this task. Once I did sync it, then it was no problem at all. But there was a moment of a little bit of confusion. So that was the biggest frustration on my personal part, getting ready for the certification. And in this case, had nothing to do with organic certification, just a little bit of software mishaps. Now, the last thing before we get into the actual episode is I have another podcast to talk to you about that I've been listening to. And actually, this podcast features the one and only Dan Brisebois of Tournesol Cooperative Farm. That's me. And so I was the guest on Farm Small, Farm Smart, hosted by Diego. And he has an episode from, when you listen to this, it's going to be 8 days before. Right now, it's just 1 day ago. But entitled, How Much Crops to Set Aside for Seed Saving? Gardening Beyond Basics, episode 35. And I've actually been a guest a number of times over the last few months talking about different aspects of growing seed. But this one episode I think is particularly timely if you are trying to think about how much seed you should harvest. And of course, if you're just new to harvesting seed, any seed is better than no seed. So just make sure you keep that in mind when you're listening to the episode. So that's my podcast recommendation for this episode. I won't have them all the time. I know I had one last week, and I have one now. But if nobody records any other CD podcast, I probably won't tell you about the other podcast I'm listening to. Anyway, let's get to the subject for today, which is going to be keeping squash for seed. So squash seed saving. And this is one that, in general, squash is not the crop that I would tell you to start keeping seed from. And the reason for that is there are 4 main species of squash out there. And if you grow one of each type of squash, there'll be no crossing. But for many of these species, you're actually probably growing a number of squash. So there's the Cucurbita pepo species, where you might be growing an acorn in a delicata or a pumpkin in a zucchini. All those are pepos, and they will happily, very, very, very happily cross together. And whereas almost any other time I encourage folks to jump into growing seed or harvesting seed, I tell you, don't worry about cross-pollination. With squash, you should worry about cross-pollination because the characteristics that make up different varieties don't always work well together. And when you get some crossing, you don't know what you have until you bite into it, or till you cut open it and cook it and then bite into it. And if you're just serving your family this mystery squash, well, depending on your family, I mean, you can cope with that. You can maybe that's just the way it is. But if you're selling this at a farmer's market or putting it into a CSA box, there might only be so much mystery squash your clients are willing to put up with. And so mystery squash is not the way that I would go for you to get into your seed journey. If that's the way you want to do it, hey, more power to you. But that's not what I'm going to encourage you to do. So there are 4 main squash species: Cucurbita, pepo, which I already mentioned, the acorns, spaghetti squash, all those. Then there's Cucurbita maxima, which are like the giant pumpkins, but also your kabochas and your curries and your turban squash and all those. And then you have what used to be called Cucurbita mixta. Now it's called, I think, Argyrosperma. I'll just go with mixta because I remember how it's said. And those are like the kasha pumpkins. And there's a lot less of those. And they're not common where I am, so I'm not going to really speak about them much. But then the last group is Cucurbita moschata. And moschata is spelt Moschata. I'm pretty sure about that as I say it from memory. And I do hear a lot of people calling it moschata. And I called it that for a while, but my brother-in-law called me on whether it's maybe a hard CH, kind of like zucchini. We don't say zucchini, or maybe most of us don't say zucchini. So kind of like zucchini, so moschata. And I've picked that up. If you know officially one way or the other, please feel free to reach out and tell me. If you don't, you can also tell me your opinion. But so Cucurbita moschata is the last species. So whereas most of the time, I don't recommend keeping squash seed, moschatas are where maybe that might change. Because, a lot of market gardens, you might be growing 5 or 6, even 10 different varieties of pepo squash. But a lot of market gardens are also only growing a couple moschata varieties, like maybe one butternut. I know there's some cheese pumpkins. There's the Muscat de Provence pumpkin. But like where we are for a long time, folks were just growing Waltham butternut as a squash, as a moschata. And if you only have one moschata in your field, then keep the seed. It's not going to cross-pollinate with anything else. And so it's a really easy situation to do that. If you have a couple varieties, you could, and this is something that when I was at the Organic Seed Alliance last year telling people not to grow squash for seed, somebody came up and talked about crossing and said, and they really agreed with me with the pepos. I think the pepos, there's such diversity, but questioned whether that was true for maximas or moscatas. And what this individual pointed out is that the maximas tend to be more richer flavored, sweeter flavored. And if you have some crosses between that, the culinary traits aren't as different one from the other as they are with different pepos. So having a little crossing between 2 maximas or 2 moscatas might not be the end of the world and might be delicious mystery squash as opposed to just mystery squash. So that's a thought. If you are just growing one moschata or only one squash of any species, do feel free to go and keep that for seed. And what's so nice is it's so easy to harvest. You can bring it into your house, you can cut it open, put the seed on the counter, and harvest that seed, and you can eat your squash. You can't do that with a lot of other things. You can do it with peppers, you can do it with tomatoes, but you can't do it with beans, you can't do it with lettuce. So it's nice to kind of bring the actual fruit in and put the seed aside. You can even taste it and say, is this a particularly sweet one? And if it is a particularly delicious squash, then keep that seed when you're putting it on your envelope, say like extra delicious or something. So it's kind of a select selection. If you're just growing 1 or 2 squash, it's easy enough to rinse out the seeds and dry them down. When you're harvesting a lot of squash, then it gets to be a trickier thing, how you're going to deal with the pulp and all that. But with 1 or 2 fruit, it's easy to do that. So if you're growing one squash of a species, keep those seeds. If you're growing a couple squash of those seeds of a species and you're feeling adventurous with your maximas or your moschattas, yeah, keep those seeds if you want. However, next year, don't switch 100% to the seed that you kept. Maybe if you're going to grow 50 or 100 squash plants, so let's say you're going to grow 100 squash plants, grow out 10 or 15 from your mystery squash seed. Grow out the other 85 from something that you know it is what you want to have in your garden. If when squash comes around and you harvest it and those 15 squash, you just love that mystery combo, then feel free to grow more next year. But I would probably only, again, double to maybe like 30% out of 100 coming from your own squash, because sometimes things change a little bit from generation to generation as they get more and more mixed up. And if you've been growing it for 3 to 4 years, after 4 years, if you've been loving this mystery squash, just go all in and give up on on growing those straight varieties. But that's not the main message of this episode. The main message is if you're growing one variety of a species, you should be harvesting that seed and you should be growing it out in the future. So that's squash seed. And now you have the knowledge to whether you should go out and do it or not. And at this point, I will plug The Seed Farmer, my not so new, yet I think fantastic book. Slightly biased being the author. But yeah, The Seed Farmer does go into a number of different crops and tells you how easy it is to grow for seed and what you should watch out for, and both as a beginner and as a more experienced grower, and has a lot of pictures and text on how to extract the seed, harvest it, clean it, all those things, dry it, and even a chapter on selling it if that's the way you want to go. But before you start selling seed, use it on your own farm. So go get some squash, maybe. And that's episode 32 of the Seed Farmer Podcast. If you are enjoying these minisodes, please tell me. If you're not enjoying them, I guess I want to hear also, and please tell me what you'd like to hear instead. But if you are enjoying them, definitely tell me. Thank you to Sophia Sedalton for the theme music. You can hear more of their music at sophiasedalton.com. Thank you to Molly Brisebois for editing this episode, and thank you so much for listening. You can find more seed growing resources on my blog at seedgrowers.farm. While you're there, you can subscribe to my newsletter full of seed growing, crop planning, and farm spreadsheets. You can also find out where to order a copy of my book, The Seed Farmer, a complete guide to growing, using, and selling your own seed. And you can support the podcast at spreadsheet.farm/support-podcast. If you haven't already subscribed, now's the time. You wouldn't want to miss the next episode. Until then, happy farming.